Okay.
Rolling, you heard that?
I did not hear that.
I saw it happen.
You did,
Okay. Interview Phil Butler. Take 3.
Okay. I had my headphones turned off.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say,
They're
I'll
powered
double
headphones,
check it.
cool.
Alright, good.
Okay. Let me
There's-
tweak focus here. Hang on
Okay.
just a sec. Okay, we're good.
There's so many things you can help me with that you speak to in your book, and I want to kind of deconstruct a pretty prevalent theme that happened in the Hanoi prison system. And I'll preface it by we talked a little bit about this when I met with you at your home.
Yeah.
That we went into Vietnam, having been the successors in World War II. You know, whatever the idea, we came out of Korea, but we had a John Wayne mentality about ourselves. We were going to overwhelm North Vietnam with our technology and et cetera. We were not prepared for the reality, the truth of not only of ourselves, but of our nation building and our national choices. We all know about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and some of the questionable things that were going on there. What happened, and this is why I feel that the story of the former POWs is the story of our country in so many ways. And it's an odd thing. I don't know what it is about us as human beings, but we can't take in a story until we have enough distance from it. Young millennials coming up today, when they hear about Vietnam, it's like us listening to stories of World War I when we were growing up. They were far enough back that they could take on the level of stories to us that we could learn from. But when we were growing up, Vietnam was too fresh. So now these young people coming up are fascinated by your stories, and they are ready to learn these lessons. One of the things that happened for all of you, and it's kind of amazing how often I've heard this theme. Pilots will talk about parachuting down, and they'll hear this pop, 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 and they'll realize they're being shot on with small arms fire, and there's a kind of shocking moment where they're like, wait a minute, I'm an American pilot. Do you know who you're shooting at? Like the reality of Vietnam, about the truth of the ground and everything else, comes in as a shocking reality. What happens then in all of your fellow former POWs is you are taken and you are tortured and you are interrogated and you are systematically broken down. Speak to me about that process, that awakening, that finding out that you couldn't be John Wayne. You couldn't take any amount of torture and never give them the more than name, rank, and serial number. The emotional arc of that, sir, if you would.
Well, first of all, there was this thing that was created, propaganda thing that we all bought into. That was created about our country called the domino theory. And the domino theory was, we all thought that's why we were out there, was that if we didn't stop North Vietnam in its tracks, that soon it would be all of Vietnam, then it would be Thailand, and then it would be Malaysia, then it would be the Philippines, and then they would come to our shores and attack us as, the red menace and all of that baloney. And so I think in the first part of the war, most of us bought into that, but then as the war went along, the truth even came into the POW camps that it was all BS. But that didn't really matter to us, because what we needed to do was we needed to stick together as a fighting unit, as a coherent unit of guys who hung together with our code of conduct and that return with honor that we developed early on in the first probably year or two. We passed this return with honor thing around. What it really meant was, to me at least, and I think to most of my fellow POWs, it meant conduct yourself in such a way in interrogations with the enemy such a way that when you come home, you'll be able to look in the mirror and be proud of the guy that's looking back at you. That's what return with honor meant. Return with your personal honor. It didn't mean motherhood and apple pie. It didn't mean the flag. It didn't mean all that stuff. You know, it was a very, very personal thing, return with honor. So is that your question?
Beautifully answered, sir. Absolutely beautiful. You okay, Bill?
Yep.
That chair is just
That
making
chair is
so
really
much
making a
noise.
lot of noise.
I wonder if we could, you think try this one?
He's been okay.
I'm sorry?
Bill and I will promise to sit still.
No, you're doing great. It's not Bill's fault. He's supposed to be moving.
I know.
He's got a moving camera,
Yeah.
but his chair is creaking. That was beautifully answered. Absolutely. Talk to me a little bit about the process of finding out that you couldn't be this heroic Superman, but you could be something else. Like you were going to be forced to get more than name, rank, and serial number. Each one of you went through that. Each one of you went through that pain, and you arose out of that and found other ways to fight the battle behind bars.
Yeah, I think that it would be better for me to talk about my personal journey through that business. And that was that I had this thing about proving my masculinity and my manhood because I had grown up around a father who was an alcoholic and eventually drank himself to death at age 44 when I was just a second classman at the Naval Academy, a junior at the Naval Academy. And my mom and dad got divorced when I guess I was like 12 or 13 years old. It was a very bad situation. He was alcoholic. My mother was an abusive person, and she was pretty much addicted to drugs, prescription drugs back in the day. So I didn't have very much parenting, but one of the parenting things I had as my father, you know, you watch your father as a kid, was my dad always emphasized that it was so important to get along with other people and to have other people like you. And I realized that he had a problem with his own masculinity later on. So in my first, I'd say 3 years, up until like the end of 1968 or so, 69, somewhere in there, yeah, 1968, 65 to 68, I tried to be one of the tough guys. I wanted to prove my masculinity. And I remember on my, I think, 29th birthday, after having been tortured and beaten, to confess some things. And this was at a camp called the Zoo. I'm sorry, no, this was a camp called Little Vegas. So I was in Little Vegas. And I remember that I had been completely beaten up and my eyes were practically swollen shut. My hands were handcuffed behind me. My legs were in leg irons and I was in a sitting position on this concrete bench in my cell by myself. And it came around to my 29th birthday and the light went on in my head. Suddenly, the light went on in my head. After having challenging these people all this time, I told interrogators to get fucked and got beaten to pieces for it and everything. And so I was frontal assault. That was my approach to being a POW in interrogations. But on my 29th birthday, as I sat there all beaten up, the light bulb went on in my head and I just suddenly said to myself, Phil, look at you. You don't have to prove your manhood. You're a man. You've done your best, you know. You're a strong guy. You don't have to go through this process of trying to prove yourself anymore. And it was just like, on that day, all the air went out of me. It was just like all this pressure and all this weight on my shoulders, it was just gone. And from that point on, I was just, I went along, I was polite to guards, I was polite to interrogators. I didn't tell them anything, but I, was a gentleman and was polite. And I found out that they treated me pretty much the same way after that. But
you make a point in your book about, and if you would say it here, that, and I think it is true, there's so much about the Asian culture about politeness.
absolutely. We even learned, that it's impolite in Asian culture to put your leg up like this, to cross your leg. That's impolite. That doesn't show respect to do that. And it's impolite to touch another person on the shoulder or the head, So they had all kinds of things, but basically they really respect being polite. So I could be an enemy and be polite at the same time, and I learned how to do that. But within a year, anyway, when Ho Chi Minh died and the whole prison system changed and they stopped the torture and the harassment and beating and pounding on us and everything, and the new guy that took over after Ho Chi Minh, Leduan, that's Leduan, he took over, and I'm sure that the pragmatists took over us, and they realized that they needed to feed us better and take care of us better and not try and beat us to pieces because we would be worth our weight in real estate at some point in time, which we were.
There's a famous story about Nelson Mandela, who was 25 years held in solitary, right? And as the stories go, they had to replace Nelson Mandela's guards constantly because he was so kind to his guards that they would end up liking him.
Yeah.
And I hear something in that theme when you started to learn about you could respect and still resist, and that you could fight that battle behind bars without self-harming, inviting self-harm. Can you speak to that?
Later on, I had an incident. I was in a cell with 45 or so guys, and I think Percy might have been our SRO in the cell. But anyway, I had this horrendous itch all over my body, and the Vietnamese had this purple stuff that you could put on for the itch. So there was a guard that I had been polite to, who in previous times had been an interrogator. But anyway, now he was a senior guard and no longer an interrogator. They weren't, I guess, using him for interrogation anymore. So anyway, one day I asked him, I said, I got a terrible itch in my crotch. Can you do anything for me? He said, okay. So the next day he came back around with a little bottle of this stuff, and I put it on. Wow. This was the wrong stuff, I'll tell you. This is what you should put on your feet and hands, but not, in your genitals. So anyway, everything I had down here started swelling up, and I had like a basketball between my legs. So of course the senior ranking officer, called out bow cow and got the officers there and told them what was gone, and then they got the guy who was supposed to the make-believe doctor, and they all came into the cell, and so there were like 3 officers and this doctor guy who had a white hat on, and they had me drop my drawers, and they were all looking at this, and they were, wow, they were, holy cow. And so they called the guy over who had been the guard, and I could tell they were chewing him out, in Vietnamese, and he was hanging his head like this. And I said to him, wait, it is not the guard's fault. Don't blame the guard. It is my fault. I used the medicine improperly. It is not the guard's fault. And little guy, his eyes got big, you know, and he looked, and they had a big discussion and everything. And they went away. The doctor gave me something else for my crotch. So after that, I got to tell you, that guy was my best friend in the prison system. If I needed anything, if somebody had a bad headache and needed an aspirin or something, you know, Phil went over and got this guy to go get it for him. He would get me anything they had to help, just because I saved his bacon.
It's such an amazing, complex thing that you're talking about right now. Because you're really talking about respect as opposed to hatred as a motivator in action. One can be against something, one can be an enemy with something and still respect. And there's something so powerful in that.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Stockdale, Commander Stockdale, then Commander, became Admiral Stockdale, told his son a story of, I think it was Rabbit, the torturer, who
I know him well, yeah.
once Ho Chi Minh died, he didn't really have a job anymore.
Right.
And they gave him the job of doing maintenance around Hello Prison. And at one point he was hanging a door and he couldn't do it on his own, and he goes and gets Stockdale out of his cell, and Stockdale talked to his son about, you know, Jim, it was so strange to be, here I was working with my enemy in the sun, and we were chatting away, and he had tortured me in the past. I had always respected him because he was good at what he did. He was a soldier like me, but I didn't like him. But I did respect that he knew what he was doing. I preferred him to his apprentice because his apprentice would actually damage me. He wouldn't damage me. He would just go to the edge. But the fact that I could work with him in this sun, you know, like in your personal journey, remember that Al Carpenter said to me, you know, and I think it was Jim Mulligan said something similar, that it was, the idea is that we go to war for our country, our nation, our patriotism and all this other stuff, but when you're actually out there with each other, it's for each other, you fight every day. Like those are the, you know, these guys have.
Or the guys next to you.
Exactly. Can you talk to me about that, sir?
Yeah, we fought for each other. We spent as much time as we could in torture because we knew that they had limited, capacity for tortures. They could only do 1 or 2 guys at a time. So the more time I could spend, if I could spend 2, 3, 4 days, you know, and endure that, then my buddies out there, somebody else didn't have to spend, you know, time in torture. So that's pretty much the way we looked at it. And I remember at the Briar Patch too, they used hell cuffs to get us to write a confession. 54 guys at the Briar Patch, every one of us wrote a confession, ultimately. But they used these hell cuffs, and we had a competition going. It was competitive to see who could last the longest in the hell cuffs after a while. And I remember coming back to my cell and telling Hayden that I had lasted 8 hours in hell cuff, and for a while that was the record in amongst a few of the hooches there until one time, I guess maybe several weeks later, they took a POW out and put him in hell cuffs. And this guy was the most mild-mannered, quiet, unassuming guy. And anyway, we were all worried about him because when the Vietnamese would scream at him in interrogation, sometimes they'd get him into tears. So we were really concerned about this guy. Well, they put him in hell cuffs, and that was the wrong way to go after this guy, because he stayed in hell cuffs for a couple of days. And finally, the Vietnamese came to his cellmate and said, "Please, tell him to stop. Tell him to give up. Tell him to stop this. We're afraid he'll lose his hands if they don't take him off." So anyway, they finally wound up taking him off, but he shattered all the records, whatever they might have been.
Was this Jerry Denton?
No. young guy.
Wow. Talk to me about one of the things you speak about. There's so many lessons in the Hanoi prison systems, lessons about leadership, about teamwork, about communication. Let's just deconstruct some of those themes right there. Your senior leaders, Stockdale, Denton, Robbie Reisner, all of you together were a remarkable group of men. Can you talk about some of the examples of leadership you saw or experienced in your own as well?
Well, we were all SROs. We were all SRO. If the SRO left, then the next guy was the SRO. If he left, then the next guy was the SRO. It just went right on down the line. It was no big deal. That's it was. You were the SRO, you were the SRO. But also, it turns out if you're the senior ranking officer, it turns out we all found out that you don't just sit in your cell and issue random orders out to the camp, because the guys out there will just blow you off. That's not how leadership acts. You actually have to reach out and get buy-in. You have to send it out to some of the junior people and some of the middle people and so forth, and find out what they think and get their take on it, and maybe slightly redefine what you were going to send out, or restate it in some way, in some words. So before you sent something out, and then once you did that, well, then everybody said, yeah, great, that's it, we'll do that. If it was like no bowing, to the guards or the interrogators, and you sent that out, and that was talked about all around the camp. And that went well for a while until they started beating the crap out of us if we didn't bow. So then the SRO sent around, it looks like, guys, that the no bowing thing is not working. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have half a bow, and instead of saying thank you, we'll say fuck you. They don't know the difference. The guard doesn't know the difference. Of course, guards soon found out what we were saying, but nevertheless, what I'm saying is, these orders are later on when we were forming up different, what we call communication nets, and some of them were top secret, and only known to a few people. So we started really getting very, very, very organized later on in the system.
This is a really important point no one else has really made, and I'd like to flesh it out a little bit more. When you're talking about leadership here, you're talking about an inclusive kind of leadership. Someone said, Stockdale, one of the things that made him such a great leader was that he never asked anything of anyone that he didn't give himself. He demonstrated it by action.
Walk your talk. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. Well, like I said, if you were the SRO, you had to act like the SRO. If I was in a cell there with 45 guys, and the senior ranking officer was always the one who went to the doorway and the bars and spoke with the other officer there. Or even, back in 1967 when I was in a cell with 8 guys, we had a guy who was the SRO. And when the Vietnamese came around to open up the doors, the senior ranking officer stood in the center, in front, and the rest of us stood back a little bit in a line behind him. And they got the picture. They knew exactly what we were doing. So they tried to destroy that. They tried to beat that up and say you have no military. There are no senior officers. Well, that's fine. They can say that all they want to, but we're still going to have our senior guy standing out here in front, and he's the one you're going to have to talk to. So they would try to talk to somebody else in the room, and the senior officer would turn around and tell me, Phil, they want you to go to an interrogation. Get your shirt on for an interrogation. And I put my shirt on and go out, and what could they do?
Excuse me, sir. we make the point about leadership, but in order for, I mean, one of the things that is so profoundly demonstrated in the Hanover prison systems is inspired followership. Your junior grades, the way that you all pull together as a unit, that it works in both ways, up the chain as far as well as down the chain. Can you
But
speak to
that's because we're all leaders, and when you're a follower, you visualize yourself in that leader's position. You visualize yourself with what he's doing. And do you want to do what he's doing, or do you want to do it better, or do you want to modify it in some way? So in your mind, you're looking at the leader. You're being a junior SRO. You're not just a follower. You're a junior leader.
Beautiful, sir. That is fantastic. There were certain instincts, and that were either a function of your training or your background or whatever it was, but for the non-military, it's pretty remarkable. There were certain instincts you all would fall back on instantly. You would arrive in a camp. The first thing to get through to someone was to get them on the wall, to get them.
Find out who the SRO is.
Exactly. So let's go
Immediately.
through those steps. The very first instinct is, where is your rank?
You come to a new camp and you find out who the SRO is, or where your rank is, and where do you fall into the thing, you know? Even in my cell with Hayden Lockhart, this is, you might think this is funny, but between the two of us, which one of us was the most senior? Well, it turns out we both graduated on exactly the same day from our respective academies. So the reason we graduated on exactly the same day and were commissioned on the same day was important in the military, because to establish, rank. But it turns out that according to Geneva Conventions, if you can't find out who's the most senior because the two guys have exactly the same rank and the same data rank, the next thing you go to is which one of you is the oldest, which one goes date of birth. So the next thing is date of birth. And I think, unfortunately, I had Hayden on date of birth by about a month or something like that, which irritated me. He thought it was great. He thought it was funny as hell. So anyway, that's the way it was in our cell. And so we played the game in our cell of me going out first every single time. Well, the Vietnamese caught on to that. This is at the Briar Patch after a while, so they began to just beat the holy hell out of me when I went out first for several days in a row. So Hayden and I talked this over, and he said, Phil, he said, I think we ought to spread the fun around. Why don't we take turns going out first? I said, okay, Hayden, that sounds like a deal. We'll take turns going out first and getting clocked. So that's what we did. But always thinking about who the senior man in the camp is, and maintaining military rank structure and discipline, because that's what gave you your power and your strength, was the power of not just yourself, but you knew that you had all these guys with you and you were together. And of course that was the huge problem in the Holocaust, because all of these poor people had no military rank or system or anything, so the Germans took advantage of them. You could take, maybe a camp of 100,000 people, and there were only, I don't know, 300 or 400 military, Yet there was no resistance, or very little resistance, because they had no military training to be together and to have a rank structure.
Profound. Just beautiful story. One of the next instincts upon establishing rank with each other is to establish lines of communication. And there were, being the seventh shot down, had the tap code even been developed by this point? Can you speak about communication?
Well, the first guys I had contact with were Bob Shoemaker and Hayden Lockhart and Smitty Harris and Bob Peel. And Smitty one day told us, he said, there's something I learned in Air Force survival. He said, I went through survival a long time before you guys do. You know, Smitty was older than the rest of us, and he was an Air Force captain. And he said that this thing was taught to us. They called it a tap code. He said, I don't know if it's going to be worth anything or not, but he said we were taught it just as a sort of a, well, here's something unusual that we got from guys in Korea who had been prisoners because they were prisoners in cells, in jails around the country for crimes that they had committed, and they've been given the opportunity to stay in jail or to go to Korea and fight with the army. So anyway, these guys had what prisoners had the world over, tap codes. Prisoners in all different language all have tap codes all over the place. Darkness at Noon, tells the story of the tap code in the Russian alphabet. So anyway, he said, here's how it's done, and we have 25 letters, so you throw out K and you can tap a C in place of K, and AFLQV, and you send a thing this way. And so we all took note of that and practiced it a little bit. And after a while, we found that it came in really handy that you could tap it through the wall, or you could tap it on the floor, or you could tap it by drying out clothes, or you could tap it, by coughing. I mean, there were just many different ways of sending the tap code. The joke in the camp was that some guys who ate so much potato soup they could tap it by farting. So anything is possible, I guess, with the tap code. The tap code finally later on evolved out to somebody invented a mute code where you could send a hand signal and get communication with somebody across the camp from one cell to another across the camp by using a mute code. And we did that by just making symbols of letters in our hands. So many different ways to communicate, but communication was primary for maintaining rank structure and discipline and teamwork and finding out what was going on.
There was another aspect of the tap code Ev talked about where he described, and maybe you can speak to this, sir. He was talking about going to Vietnam years after the war. He was brought back to look as part of a documentary, and he resisted going and didn't want to go. And someone had warned him ahead of time, well, Ev, if you go back, you'll go through all kind of emotional trauma. This is going to really be upsetting to you. And he said, Patrick, they took me in to Hanoi Hilton. They said, Ev, this is the cell you were in for the first couple of years. And he goes, actually, that's not the cell. And they go, Ev, you're not remembering right. And he said, the camera's right here waiting for the tears and everything.
Yeah.
I'll show you where the cell is. And he shows him the cell. He goes back to his hotel that night and he says to himself, is there something wrong with me? Because I'm not feeling all this emotion returning. And he said, and then I realized, Patrick, that we had taken all of our pain to the wall. We had shared our defeats with each other. We had shared our successes. We talked constantly with each other. We had each other to walk through those levels of pain together. Can you speak to that, sir? Was that did you have experiences along that line? Was there a way in which communication offered more than just networking and organization?
When we left North Vietnam, just before we left, we were all in Wallow camp together, 400 or 500 guys. And they actually allowed us to come out and talk to each other and so on and so forth. But we all made up our minds that we would have a POW organization that we would carry from the prison to outside to try and help each other and stick together. So we actually figured out who was going to be our first president, and all this stuff. Guys figured all this stuff out. So we did have that when we came home. When I came home, the people that I looked to in San Diego were some of my fellow POWs. After I was in and out of Balboa Hospital, I was in and out of Balboa Hospital for about the first 8 or 9 months, I guess, something like that. But going through a divorce, other guys around me were having family problems, so we, got together and compared notes and stuck together. And they were the people initially that I could rely on. So we just carried that teamwork and that cohesion pretty much right out into the open. I think Bob Mitchell encountered that when we first came back that first year to get our annual physicals. I'm sure he encountered that big time, and we had hung together, and we're still hanging together.
You speak about something that I think is such a profound thing, and I'd like to put a little focus on. And sir, would you like to take a little break?
Mhm.
That'd be good?
Yep.
Okay, so let's cut. Let me hit the sound. Sure. Also, I want to undo that chime out there. Yeah. Hold on 1 second. You heard that? Cut A camera.
Cut B, and grab the black magic.
See, I guess I better get unhooked
yeah,
here.